Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you all for having me. So humans are embedded in social networks, and these networks obey very particular mathematical, biological, psychological, and sociological rules. And if we can understand these rules, it gives us whole new ways to intervene in networks to make them better. And in the broadest sense, taking the embeddedness of human beings in networks seriously allows us to begin to shift our gaze to the externalities of our interventions. So what I'm interested in is not so much the response to treatment among the treated. I'm interested in the response to treatment among the untreated. I want to know when we implement clinical or policy interventions in a group of people, not so much how do they respond, but how does everyone else around them respond? And how might we exploit some of these insights in order to magnify the impact of our interventions based on many of the tools that we've been discussing today. So for the past 10 years, I've been asking ourselves a question. So what if we can understand the structure and function of human social networks? What can we do with that knowledge to make the world better? And I'm going to quickly review with you some of our experiments that we've been doing most recently over the last 10 years. But before I do that, I'd like to start with just the very briefest of introduction of some basic principles having to do with social network structure. So here is a network map of 105 people and who their friends are. Every dot is a person. Every line between them represents a friendship in this case, although it could be a coworker or a neighbor or a sibling, for example. And this is what a real social network looks like. It is heterogeneous locations. People within networks are not all the same. They occupy different positions. And this can be quantified mathematically in a number of ways. 3 of the most basic ways are illustrated on this slide. So if you look, for example, at the upper left, you have node B. Node B has 4 connections. And on the far right, node D has 6 connections. This is known as the degree of a node, the number of connections it has. And this is something people typically know about themselves. How many friends do you have? You have 10 friends. You have 8 friends. I have no friends. People know this about themselves. But there are also higher order phenomena or higher order properties of individuals within networks. For example, if you look at nodes C and D, C has 6 friends in the middle of the network and D has 6 friends. And this might be the limit of their understanding of their social location within the network. But we, with this bird's eye view, can see that C and D are very different. And I can cultivate this intuition in you by asking you, who would you rather be if a deadly germ was spreading through the network? You'd rather be D. You should have the intuition that D is going to be less likely to get whatever's spreading and less likely to get it early in the course of the epidemic. Now who would you rather be if a juicy piece of gossip were spreading through the network? You'd rather be C. So what happens to you, whether you acquire information or are affected by germs, can depend on this aspect of the network, that is to say, how central you are in the network. And this can be quantified mathematically in many ways with things like eigenvector centrality or betweenness centrality, so we can tell the difference between C and D. Finally, if you look at nodes A and B, B on the upper left, A on the lower left, they both have 4 connections, but the difference between the two is that the friend of B's is not a friend of B's, whereas the friend of A's, the friend of a friend of A's, is back again a friend of A's. So A's friends are friends with each other, whereas B's friends are not friends with each other. This is known as the transitivity of a node, and it can also be quantified in a variety of ways. So with that very trivial introduction to sort of structural aspects of networks, let me launch right into a quick review of 3 broad ways we might intervene in social networks to make them better and enhance public health and public policy using social networks for good. So my lab and many labs around the country have been advancing science in this area. One of the first ways that I'm going to quickly introduce you to is this notion of contagion, or changing the flows. So here the idea is, given a structure of a network, in whom should we intervene so as to maximize the flow of whatever it is we introduce it? If you're a bioterrorist, the question is, who should you infect so that if you infect that person, everyone else will be infected? But if you're trying, for example, to increase adoption of new test ordering practices or a new pharmaceutical agent in a network of doctors, which doctors should you detail so that if you detail those doctors, all the other doctors in the healthcare system will change their practice? Or if you have a group of patients and you're trying to get them to enhance their diabetes self-care, for instance, which patients should you focus your interventions on such that if they improve their self-care, other patients around them will copy them, and so you will magnify the impact of your intervention. These type of interventions are contagion interventions. A totally different class of interventions are connection interventions. In these interventions, you manipulate the structure of the network. So here the idea is, how should we connect people to each other such that if we connect them in a particular way, it enhances desirable properties that we might want? A trivial example of this might be, for instance, Alcoholics Anonymous. You take a group of people who don't know each other, you connect them to each other, you introduce them, and you enhance their capacity for sobriety. So a structural intervention of who you introduce to who could have a beneficial impact. And a last idea that we've been very recently exploring in my laboratory that's much more subtle and that has also been intersecting with some of our work on artificial intelligence is what we call position interventions, or changing the location. So a simple model of this might be, you're a teacher, you have a seating plan for your classroom, and the chairs are nailed to the floor, you have 20 seats, and you have 20 students. To which chairs should you assign these students such that learning is optimized? Should you put all the best students in the front row and the weak students in the back row? Should you reverse that? Should you alternate the students? It's the positioning of the students in a network topology that's now the question, given a choice set of individuals that you have to slot into it. And this also we have been doing some experiments with. Let me show you some of those experiments in each of these categories, just a quick introduction to some of the work that we've been doing. This sets the stage for how we might go about manipulating contagion. We work primarily in the developing world, in Honduras, in India, and Uganda, and other parts of the developing world, but we've also done work domestically, and so have others, in schools, in churches, in workplaces, and the like. Imagine you map two networks, the network on the left and the network on the right, and on the right you have just enough resources to target the 6 individuals that are colored yellow here with a public health intervention. You go in and you teach them about vaccination or maternal and child health, for example. The usual perspective in public health trials is to come back a year later and see what fraction of those 6 people might have responded. Perhaps, for instance, 3 of those 6 people will have responded. But that's not what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in response to treatment among the treated. I'm interested in response to treatment among the untreated. I want to know, what does everyone else in the village do as a result of you targeting those 6 yellow individuals shown on the right? So perhaps in this case, 3 of those 6 yellow individuals responded, and they recruited 3 of their friends for a total of 6 people responding to the intervention in the right-hand village. Meanwhile, in the control village on the left, to whom no intervention was given, by secular change, perhaps 2 people respond. That difference between 6 and 2 is the pure measure of the peer effects in this type of an intervention. But now you should have the intuition that maybe you don't need to pick the 6 people at random. Maybe you could use mathematical tools to identify particular individuals who are structurally influential, such that if you intervened upon them, they might create bigger spillovers. For example, you might pick 6 central individuals, defined along the lines that I just introduced a couple of slides ago. So here you might again target those 6 people, maybe 3 of them respond, but maybe they recruit 30 of their friends to respond. Same village, same intervention, same number of people targeted, 10 times the effect, because you have shrewdly exploited the power of networks to magnify what they're seeded with, and now increase the impact of whatever it is that you're doing by enhancing spillover effects within that network. So we can experiment, in fact, with different algorithms for picking such potentially influential nodes. And my lab has been inventing and testing a variety of such algorithms. How do we define people, not so much by attributes of themselves, but like, for example, their height or their age or their diagnoses or things like that, but rather how do we define them by virtue of where they are in a network? So this is just a paper we published a couple of years ago now in The Lancet. Was one of our first papers documenting this in a randomized controlled trial. We took 33 villages in Honduras. We randomly assigned the villages to different network targeting algorithms. So this third of the villages, 5% of the people were chosen at random. And this third of the villages, 5% of the people were chosen according to who had the most connections, who had the highest degree. And this third of the villages, 5% of the people were chosen to a different kind of network structural algorithm that we have been testing. And this slide illustrates what the targets might look like in the same village if you were picking them by 2 different means. So the orange dots are 5% of the people chosen at random, and the yellow dots are people chosen according to whether they had the highest degree in the network. And then we delivered a variety of interventions. I'm just going to show you the results for a multivitamin intervention. Here on the x-axis is the days since initial targeting with a public health intervention. On the y-axis is the proportion of people who have adopted the multivitamins. And what we show is that using one particular targeting algorithm, which I didn't define for you, but it's in the paper, you can optimize adoption in these villages, getting 75% approximately adoption within 2 weeks using this technology. Here's a totally different experiment now involving the manipulation of connection, leaving contagion behind us and just looking at connection. So in this experiment, what we did is we've developed software that allows us to create temporary artificial societies of real people. It's integrated with Amazon Mechanical Turk, and we can, in a godlike way, define these societies, define the interactions between people, and experiment upon them in various sorts of ways. And we've done, I think, 30,000 people have participated in our experiments. In this experiment, in the lower part of the experiment, what we did is we brought people and we dropped them into a network that had this structure. This is an Urgis-Renyi random graph with 30% tie saturation. Doesn't matter, it's a network. People are dropped into the network and they're introduced to their neighbors. And they play something known as a public goods game. It's a kind of economic game that looks at how generous might they be to their neighbors and whether their neighbors might reciprocate that kindness. So do I cooperate with my neighbors and do they in turn cooperate with me? The nice cooperative people are shown in blue at the beginning, and the mean defectors who take advantage of their neighbors, who don't contribute to the public good, are shown in red. This is like high school science projects, where you're given a bunch of duds and they're not doing their job, and if you do the work, they get some of the credit, and your choices all suck, right? You either have to do the work for everybody, or you also defect and don't do the work, and then you get an F, right? So what happens in this situation is that people are introduced to their neighbors. The neighbors are defecting and they play multiple rounds of the game. And what happens is these initially cooperative blue dots get pissed off and they stop cooperating. And by the end, defection takes over the system, except for these few little blue dots on the edge here keeping civilization alive. So people, when they're exploited, they don't like to be exploited. They also switch to defection. And as a result of that, cooperation disappears from this social system. In a different branch of the experiment, what we did is we manipulated the rules of connection. In this branch of the experiment, we allowed people, in addition whether to choose to cooperate or defect, to rewire their networks in very specific ways. And in that branch of the experiment, cooperation persisted. Here's the point. I can take you people and connect you one way and make you really sweet to each other. Or I can take you same people and connect you a different way and make you mean sons of bitches to each other. So the same people can give rise to different properties, not given who they are, but rather how they are connected to each other. And we have done many experiments that show that. Another experiment that manipulates connection, which I'm going to whip through, and then I'm going to show you a final experiment and close with one idea, is this experiment, which involves some of our investigation of the impact of inequality. So everyone is concerned about the impact of inequality on health, on wealth production in our society. We decided to use our platform to do some experiments in which we created artificial societies with higher or lower levels of inequality. We randomly assigned people to be rich or poor. We gave them real money to play with. And then we dropped them into these little societies and had them interact with each other. And we furthermore manipulated in these societies whether or not people could see the wealth of their neighbors. This paper was published in Nature a couple of years ago now. So on the left-hand side, you have a network. The dot size is proportional to how rich people are. The letter, bigger dots are richer people. The letter at the beginning indicates whether they were randomly assigned to be rich, PR, or P, poor. And here they cannot see each other's wealth. They play the same kind of public goods game I introduced a moment ago. And their Gini coefficient is artificially created by us to be 0.4. That's a very high Gini. That's American or Moroccan levels of inequality. Scandinavian levels would be about 0.2. Total equality is 0, a Gini of 0. So they're put in this very unequal world. They play the game, and they cannot see each other's wealth. And by the end, the Gini has come way down. Inequality has been greatly reduced. The blue color indicates the cooperators again. The red color indicates the defectors. Everyone's very nice to each other. Most people are cooperating. And all the dots are big. Everyone is really rich. In the other side of the experiment, we randomly assigned other people. There were 1,500 people in this experiment. We flip a switch, and now we make each other's wealth visible. Now you can see how rich your neighbors are. And here you get none of these beneficial effects. The inequality stays high, more red dots, people are less cooperative, and there's less wealth produced. In fact, and this broke my left-wing heart, what we found was that actually inequality didn't have any bad effects in these societies, but visibility was very corrosive. So on the x-axis is the round number across time. On here is the average wealth produced by these societies. The dotted lines indicate the invisible wealth condition. The solid lines are the visible wealth condition. And then the colors indicate how unequal was the wealth at the beginning. You can see that there's not a lot of difference given how unequal the wealth was randomly created to be at the beginning, but invisibility was very advantageous. People were much better able to work together to produce wealth if they could not see the inequality in their societies. And you get very similar results with respect to the amount of cooperation. Once again, inequality is not what's really ruining cooperation, it's visibility between individuals. Finally, I'd like to look at some experiments of ours involving position. And this line of work also intersects with some of our new work on artificial intelligence and the addition of bots to systems of humans in what we call hybrid systems of humans and machines. So we are in the midst right now of creating heterogeneous systems of people and AI, or people and robots, like autonomous vehicles. And the question is, how will these hybrid systems work, and what are some ideas we might exploit to enhance the performance of groups of people arrayed in this fashion? So there's a little bit of garbling here on this axis, but let me just illustrate to you these results. Once again, we drop people into a network, and now we give them not a cooperation challenge, but a coordination challenge. We give them each a color, one of 3 random colors, orange, yellow, or purple, and we tell them they can change their color whenever they want over 5 minutes, and they change their color every second or so. And the challenge is to pick a color dissimilar from their neighbors. If everyone picks a color dissimilar from their neighbors, if the group works together to solve the problem, they get paid. And the whole group gets paid. But if they're unable to work together to solve the problem, they do not get paid. So everyone wants to pick a color dissimilar from their neighbors, and every second or two, they look around them and they change their colors. So for example, this node here is orange. This node should switch to purple, so as no longer to be in conflict with his 2 neighbors. The color conflicts are shown in red. The red ties indicate 2 nodes that are connected that are in conflict, and the purple ties indicate 2 nodes that are connected that are not in conflict. On the y-axis is the number of color conflicts. On the x-axis is time. There are 2 kinds of conflicts, which I won't go into right now, and it turns out that the people start solving the problem. At 105 seconds, 1 conflict persists, but it's irresolvable. Neither of the 2 yellow dots can make a change to eliminate the conflicts, because if either of them change, they'd be in conflict with others of their neighbors. Nevertheless, they make a switch. Maybe they temporarily increase conflicts, and by the end of the game, or 245 seconds, everyone has picked a different color than their neighbors, and the problem is solved. So what did we do in this experiment? In this experiment, what we did is how hybrid systems of humans and machines, or artificial intelligence, could work together. Because we were sneaky, we surreptitiously replaced some of the humans with bots. We randomly assigned 4,000 people to 230 groups, some of whom were just composed of humans, and some of whom were composed of humans and bots. And we endowed these bots with very simple programming. And what we did is we measured what fraction and how fast of a group of people, a group of groups, could solve the problem. So on the y-axis is the probability that the group has not solved the problem, the game, and on the x-axis is time. So the yellow line indicates that just human groups. At the beginning, 100% of the groups haven't solved the game, and by the end, at 5 minutes, about 65% of the human groups have solved the game. And then we experimentally manipulated the programming of the bots, making them either perfect. Every 1.5 seconds, they looked at their neighbors and they picked a color that had the minimum conflicts with their neighbors, or making them slightly noisy, so they maybe or occasionally deliberately made a mistake, or very noisy. Sometimes they made many mistakes. And we manipulated whether we put them randomly in the network, in the center of the network, or in the periphery of the network. And to make the long story short, we found that if we added slightly noisy bots, little bits of error, into the center of the network, we could enhance the ability of these groups to work together to solve the problem. So it's this ability of bots to work with humans to help the humans to help themselves. And we are building on this work to design and add simple bots to other situations involving social dilemmas and collective action problems. We are exploring the kinds of simple programming what we call dumb AI, that might make them effective, not just the noisiness idea or position idea that I just introduced. And these bots can also be used to address other sorts of social problems, like combating inequality or racism online, for example. So the gist of this idea is that in my lab, we are not focused on developing super smart AI to replace human cognition. We are developing dumb AI to supplement human interaction. We just want to add a social catalyst. We just want to reduce the difficulty of humans working together to solve their own problems. So think about these two objects. As you all know, they are both made of carbon. On the left, you have graphite, which is soft and dark. And on the right, you have diamond, which is hard and clear. And there are two key intellectual ideas here. First of all, these properties of softness and darkness and hardness and clearness are not properties of the carbon atoms, they're properties of the collection of carbon atoms. And second, which properties you get depends on how you connect the carbon atoms to each other. Connect them one way, you get one set of properties. Take the same carbon atoms and connect them another way, you get a completely different set of properties. And it's the same with our connections and the performance of human groups. New properties emerge in human groups, not because of who the people are, but rather because of how they are connected to each other and how some of the phenomena that I've been describing this morning work together. New properties such as cooperation and violence, health and happiness, innovation and productivity emerge because of the connections, because of the ties between people, and not necessarily because of the people themselves. So it's not just what's happening in the people around us that matters. Our experience of the world also depends on the actual structure of the ties around us, near and far. Thank you very much.